Well, thanks everyone for joining this first roundtable called From Beneficiaries to Participants, Mapping as an Engagement Tools for Communities. So my name is Martin Noblecourt. I'm a Missing Maps Project Manager at CartONG, and I will be facilitating this roundtable for which we have 4 presenters. Three of them are online here, and one of them did record a presentation because he preferred to present in French. So we have a video presentation that has been subtitled. So quick round of introduction before we start. So this first presenter that will have a video is called Sayouba Tiemtore. He's from a Burkinabe NGO called Yaam Solidarité, with implementing project in urban renewal and reconstruction in informal neighborhoods in Ouagadougou. We've been working with them at CartONG for a couple of years, and he will present how participatory mapping has been integrated in the projects. I would say progressively, like they are not NGO specialized in mapping, but they embedded more and more mapping as part of their participatory efforts. Our second presenters will be Bea Varnai from urbaMonde, which is a French-Swiss NGO also working in urban planning, both in Europe and worldwide. And they have their project that she will present is to design city with a participatory angle, and she will also present as the way mapping has become a tool that they use in their approaches. We'll then have Geoffrey Kateregga from Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team in Uganda, presenting their activities. So I think everybody is familiar with OpenStreetMap now, but he will present how OSM has been transformative in their actions over the years, in particular in Uganda. And we will conclude with Vanessa Gautier from F3E, which is a network specialized in learning and evaluation innovation for the NGO sector. The aid sector in general, sorry. So Vanessa has no background in mapping in general. She's a bit our outsider for this presentation, and she will try to bring an external look from a different angle based on the participatory approaches they have developed at F3E. So the general idea for this panel, as you saw when you registered, is to question our participatory approaches a bit, because both in general in the GIS mapping and IM sector and in participatory mapping sector in particular, we've had several discussions over the past GONG on the topic, and a lot of other conferences, Hot Summit, etc. And my impression is that most of the time we really focus on the technical angle, like how to implement good participatory project, how to get people involved in a specific participatory mapping projects, but we not very often question how participatory mapping can be transformative in the activities of NGOs, local actors, etc. So the idea of this panel, in linked with the GONG general title of inclusion, was to try to go a step further and to discuss how participatory mapping is impacting projects, how we can get more organization on board, and what kind of alternative approaches we can get besides the purely technical aspects. So I will now try to display you Sayouba's presentation. With the sound. Okay. So I'm starting the presentation. If there is a problem, let me know in the chat.
Aujourd'hui, nous allons vous présenter le projet de l'association Yaam Solidarité au Burkina Faso, quel apport de la cartographie dans les projets communautaires. Donc, je me présente, je suis M. Tiemtore Sayouba, architecte et président de l'association Yaam Solidarité. L'association Yaam Solidarité est une structure créée en 2011. Donc, une association à but non lucratif dont l'ambition est d'améliorer l'habitat, le cadre de vie des populations défavorisées et l'utilisation des matériaux locaux. Après avoir mené le projet d'habitat participatif en zone forestière, L'association s'est déployée depuis 2016 sur des projets d'aménagement participatif dans les quartiers non lotis, quartiers informels, dans les arrondissements 7 de Ouagadougou. Depuis février 2020, l'association met en œuvre un programme dénommé pour habiter et mieux vivre dans les non lotis, avec l'accompagnement technique et financier des partenaires tels l'AFD, la Fondation Abbé Pierre, CRATER, urbaMonde, 4 ONG, OSM Burkina, la mairie d'arrondissement de Ouagadougou. Il faut savoir qu'au Burkina Faso, sur les généralités des quartiers non lotis, les quartiers informels sont communément appelés non lotis. Ce sont des quartiers généralement situés dans les périphéries de la ville et régis par un système de fonctionnement, un système foncier traditionnel, des habitats faits de briques et de brocs autoconstruits par les habitants. L'insuffisance ou l'absence de services sociaux de base et on observe une absence d'aménagement. Autre généralité sur les quartiers non lotis, c'est que le constat qu'on fait, c'est que ce sont des construits qui sont construits en marge d'un processus d'urbanisation formelle, légale des quartiers, souvent invisibles dans les documents d'urbanisme. Pourtant, ces quartiers, dans certaines villes, les populations ne pas près du tiers de la population. Donc, ces quartiers sont généralement dépourvus des équipements, des services de base et d'infrastructures. C'est au regard de ce contexte que l'association Yaam Solidarité, en collaboration avec OSM et 4 ONG, organise depuis 2017 des activités de cartographie participative en vue d'une meilleure prise de décision en matière d'aménagement, de donner plus de visibilité à ces quartiers, l'existence de ces quartiers à travers la représentation cartographique et de donner une facilité de gestion des ressources dans ces quartiers non lotis de façon générale dans l'arrondissement de Ouagadougou. Les activités que nous menons à travers la cartographie participative sont en général les mapatons via la communauté OSM. La formation des jeunes sur les outils de collecte de données via le mobile, l'organisation des ateliers cartes citables, des ateliers de cartographie avec les habitants, l'organisation des diagnostics marchands avec les populations. On observe qu'il y a vraiment un impact significatif, en tout cas de l'utilisation de cette cartographie participative sur nos projets. En effet, la cartographie participative permet une meilleure connaissance et une appropriation du territoire par les populations. Elle permet aux habitants et aux acteurs du territoire d'appréhender leur territoire. Par exemple, elle permet d'identifier les zones à risque, les zones inondables, les dissages sauvages, les voiries, les voies dégradées, les habitats précaires. Elle permet aussi de recenser les points d'intérêt souvent invisibles, notamment les équipements, les points d'eau, les centres d'intérêt, les centres de santé. Enfin, c'est aussi un moyen aussi, à travailler avec les habitants, de pouvoir relever les forces et les faiblesses du territoire. La cartographie participative, pour nous, permet de mieux cerner finalement et de définir les besoins des habitants. L'implication des populations les permet d'avoir une meilleure connaissance des centres d'intérêt et les besoins. Nous pouvons dire que la cartographie participative est un outil d'aide à la décision pour les populations et les acteurs du développement, car elle permet une catégorisation, une hiérarchisation des forces et faiblesses existantes sur ces territoires par les populations concernées. Elle permet de donner une vision globale de la répartition des équipements sociaux collectifs dont les populations ont besoin sur ces territoires. Grâce à l'implication des parties prenantes, elle peut par moments jouer un rôle de plaidoyer et cherche activement à faire reconnaître les espaces communautaires, donc c'est-à-dire les domaines ancestraux, les zones cultivables, les zones vulnérables. C'est un outil d'aide finalement à la décision qui peut aussi aider les communes, les futures interventions dans le cadre de la restructuration urbaine de ces quartiers. Voilà. Grâce à ces cartographies participatives, nous avons mis en place des outils qui permettent de mobiliser la communauté. Et pour cela, nous avons initié pas mal d'ateliers cartes sur table à travers des thématiques, donc la voirie, les habitations, l'inondation et la gestion des déchets. Et grâce à ce travail de proximité avec les habitants et ce diagnostic marchand, nous, avec les habitants, nous avons pu déployer donc, dans ces catégories des cartes, la cartographie qui permet de renseigner sur les différents thèmes, de renseigner sur les différentes entités, les espaces à fort potentiel qui peut exister et aussi de pouvoir permettre aux habitants de pouvoir mieux connaître davantage et mieux se déplacer facilement dans ces ruelles et vénelles. La cartographie aussi, c'est un moyen, en tout cas pour le projet, de pouvoir basculer à des actions concrètes parce qu'elle permet de pouvoir, à travers les ateliers thématiques, de discuter avec les habitants et de pouvoir situer dans l'espace du territoire non loti des programmes tels les espaces publics, l'installation, pouvoir identifier les projets de voirie participatif.
J'arrête mon partage. I'm stopping. Sorry, switching to English. I'm stopping my screen sharing. Yep, I think we're back. So forgot to say, but thanks to our volunteer Kelly, who did the subtitles. We saw in the meantime that Sayouba joined in the chat. So if you have questions to him, you can also put them in writing, and he will try to answer and will translate if needs be. So without further ado, we will switch to the second presentation from Bea. Bea, if you want to share your screen, don't forget to turn on your mic.
Yes, hello, good morning, everyone. So I'm going to just start my screen share. There you go. You should be able to see it.
Yep.
Well, thank you for joining this conversation, and also thanks for the invitation. So I'd like to actually start with a quote or kind of a slogan of one of our partners, which is Slum Dwellers International, a network of slum dwellers, city dwellers from across 30 countries. And what they used to say, or what they'd like to say, is information is power. And this for us is a bit of a guideline for the work we're doing and implementing with our partners. And I think, you know, power in terms of collecting data, mapping, but also managing that information and storing it. So we also heard, I think it was very interesting in the plenary session this morning that, you know, power can go in both ways. You can use it for the, let's say, common good, or also against it. So, you know, I think it's important maybe to just start with this idea that when we're talking about mapping, participation, it's also about these power relations that we can change through our work. So, you know, what SDI would say is that basically slum dwellers are people that live in those neighborhoods, and you heard it also from Sayouba just in his presentation. They can collect data for themselves because they are the ones who know their neighborhoods the most. That they can also use that data very concretely for advocacy work or for any, you know, objective that they want to achieve with it. And we also heard a few examples of that from Sayouba just now. And the other aspect is also that they can, you know, develop tools that are at their hands and also keep ownership basically of the information that is gathered or the data that is produced. And I think this is, we talk a lot generally about, like, you know, how do you collect information? How do you store it? Why do you do it? And who does it? But we tend to think less about, or at least have less conversations about what happens next, you know, like who keeps ownership over the information that is gathered, over the maps, over data that is produced. So I just wanted to have this as a kind of a, you know, forward to our conversation today. And I think SDI has been doing a very inspirational work on at least getting out these ideas and sharing them across grassroots communities. So, well, very quickly, just about us. So urbaMonde, thanks for introducing us, Martin, is a French and Swiss nonprofit organization. we work on the promotion of community-led housing, which is, all kinds of participatory, community-led, community-driven forms of the access of housing, but also neighborhood upgrading. And participatory planning is part of that, of course. So we work in France and Switzerland and Europe, but also through cooperation projects in West Africa and Latin America and in Asia. And part of our work revolves around documentation and the promotion of different tools and mechanisms and a dissemination of models around community-led housing. We don't do that alone, so we work with a network that is called Co-Habitat Network, and which gathers basically different grassroots organizations, civil society organizations, but also academic institutions and actors, and support organizations that work in the field of community-led housing, quite broadly speaking, and interestingly, not just from the global south or what we call the global north, but from both, so really a worldwide network. So jumping a bit into our experiences in terms of participatory mapping and planning. So I'd like to also welcome my colleagues from urbaMonde from Senegal who are connected today, so they can contribute to the conversations later, also in French, and then we can translate. So the first example I want to refer to is the work that we've been doing with urbaMonde around participatory planning in Dakar in the context of neighborhood upgrading and in response to the context of recurrent floodings that occurred in the outskirts of Dakar and still do. So this is a work that we started around 2007 and which evolved around organizing focus groups, enumerating homes, and really coming up with a community upgrading or neighborhood upgrading plan and also an investment plan. So this work, interestingly, took two years. So maybe one first lesson or first idea is that, if you do thorough mapping and participation around it, it takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. So as a result of this process, there was a community neighborhood upgrading plan for one of the municipalities of Dakar that was established. 6,000 homes were enumerated, and a municipal office was created in one of the municipalities of Dakar that received later all the data that was gathered through this process in the 2 years and is now managing it. One of the aspects that were introduced, so here you can see the community, one of the outcomes, as a map. And here you can see land titles, preliminary land titles that were also issued to the community members through this process. In parallel to these, workshops and focus groups and the enumeration that took place, we also introduced, or urbaMonde introduced, drone mapping. Here you can see our colleagues with some visitors from across West Africa at an exchange that was organized by SDI. And of course, drone mapping always sounds very attractive and attracts a lot of interest, but I wanted to share this example because it's typically one of those examples that are really very useful, but also not necessarily particularly inclusive to the communities because, it needs a lot of resources. It's quite complex to put in place. You need to train people. And it's quite expensive as well. But what is interesting is when you basically combine, these kind of technologies with other processes. So here, for instance, you can see how we use the drone maps as layers, background layers for different community processes, So this is just a side note on tools. I will get back to this later, but I think it's something that's interesting to always think about, the kind of tools you use and how they relate also and enable community participation. So later on in Dakar, the process that we're in right now, there was a bit of a shift, which is basically also inspired by the Slum Dwellers International or SDI network, because when the Federation joined SDI, they got also interested in the community mapping processes. And today what is happening is that we've worked on more accessible, easily accessible tools that can be used by the communities for their mapping processes. So today you will see federation members that will be, roaming around the neighborhoods of their municipalities, conducting focus group mapping, and gathering different kinds of data. And again, we use, for instance, the drone map layers for some of the processes where we need like very, detailed, also GIS information and localization points. But we always work with the federation or the community members. And you can see also a shift in, when you remember the first pictures that I showed you, the kind of people who participate here, it's elderlies, it's community leaders, traditionally that have the say, let's say, in Dakar's neighborhoods. And there is a shift to, also bringing in other kinds of people, younger people who are interested also in technology or have a, also different view on the neighborhoods, but also women who may be traditionally more excluded from these processes or have less of a say, at least, intuitively in things that, when you talk about public realm, public space and neighborhood. So again, this is a side note to say it's very important, the way whom you include, of course, and for which processes you will have different kinds of people participating and being able to participate to mapping exercises. Another aspect of what we do together with urbaSen and the Federation in Senegal is enabling peer exchanges with SDI members, federations from other countries from across Africa. Here you can see two Federation members from Senegal at an exchange, peer exchange in Nigeria around community mapping, around participatory mapping processes. They did field work, and basically Nigeria, the Federation in Nigeria is doing a very inspirational work in terms of really using the data that is collected for very specific advocacy purposes. So as an example, they would use data collected in focus groups or neighborhood profiles to advocate for the access to drinking water, for instance, with their municipality. Or they would do enumeration to fight against evictions, which is a very serious issue for the communities in Lagos, but also elsewhere in Nigeria. So this comes back a bit to this idea of, why do we map? Why do we collect and gather data? And one of the important aspects is to really, have a very clear objective of that. The clearer it is, the more effective you can use data collection processes, and the clearer it is also for the community of why they're doing this work. And to finish, or in last example I wanted to bring today to the table is about a process that we've been supporting SDI with in Latin America, which is basically a peer exchange between federations from Africa and civil society organizations in Latin America on participatory mapping within the New York City program of SDI. So this program supported civil society organizations in 7 countries across Latin America. Of course, those organizations in Latin America have a lot of experience already in mapping and using mapping and community participation as a tool for, advocacy work, but also for mobilizing the community. But what was really interesting, so here you can see some of the outcomes from different cities, but I think, the most important or interesting thing about this exchange was actually how community leaders from Latin America engaged with those from South Africa, from Nigeria, despite, language barriers. But the way they exchanged and shared their ideas on what it means, to work in your community, to collect data, how you can keep ownership over it, what it can mean to you and your community. And it was very inspirational to see the way, the way that the community is connected, but also, of course, the professionals connected on these issues. And here you can see, it's just interesting to see that, you will have these processes going on in Dakar, which is the left picture, and then also you will have these ladies from Lima also doing, similar work, and it's interesting to bring these together to share their learnings. Yes, and basically just to sum up some of the ideas that I think we can maybe later also discuss together is some key lessons or just thoughts that I'd like to share. So one is on what I mentioned about, what is the objective? Why are we mapping? Why are we collecting data? And how this understanding should be not only shared and understood by everyone, but also co-constructed. The community should be involved in that process. And then coming to the term, process, how are we mapping? How are we conducting data collection? And I do think that the process is or should be just as important as the results. So, which of course is a very basic principle of when we talk about participation. But we also heard, interestingly, I think this morning in the plenary session about, there's these shiny results or products that you can produce through mapping or data collection processes. Well, how did you get there? Which is, I think, very important. And again, it's I think it's clear to everyone, but then when you're in your everyday work and you have limited time and resources, I think it's very important to really remind you that aspect constantly and to find very practical ways of, making it a meaningful process, both to the professionals, practitioners, but also for the communities. There's a question, then again, very related to this, involving the communities at all stages. So not only, relying on them for mapping or collecting data, but also, again, sharing why are we doing this, how are we doing this, but also very importantly, I think, about who keeps the data, what do we do with it, and how can we use it actually for our work once that we've collected all this information. Of course, the choice of tools is very determinant for the level of participation that we will achieve. So generally, of course, the more complex a tool is, or the more expensive, the more exclusive it will be. So I gave the example of, drone mapping, which can be very useful. But again, of course, it's not going to be the tool that will enable many people to participate, or the community to participate in a very meaningful way. But you can combine those tools with others that are more accessible. And I think it's about finding the right balance between, a process that is meaningful to the community, but also yields reliable, interesting, and important results. Maybe just the last thought is about the importance that we see in enabling spaces, opportunities for peer learning. Today is one of those, but also very importantly, I think it's important to, well, it's crucial to enable those spaces also for community members, not just for practitioners, but also for the people on the ground, to share their vision on, data collection, on mapping. And it's sometimes forgotten also and difficult to, to really put in place, but I think there's a very, very big added value in it. So yeah, I think that's it for now. We can come back to some of these examples later on. And I guess I hand over back to Martin.
Yep, thanks a lot, Bea. So as I see, we have a first question. So just if you want to start asking questions to the panelists, please use by preference the Q&A menu you have on the bottom. So you can write your questions there and we will tackle them afterward. Suzy already asked a question to Sayouba that we translated him and he will answer by written. So we will read his answer as soon as it's ready. And you can also start asking other questions in the Q&A. rather than the chat. So I hand over for the next presentation to Geoffrey.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Geoffrey Kateregga. I work with the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. I'm also part of Map Uganda, which is a local NGO for the OpenStreetMap community in Uganda. So I just want to share our experiences and lessons learned around participatory mapping that we have done over in the past few years in Uganda. So OpenStreetMap Uganda, or simply what we call Map Uganda, is an organization in Uganda now, but we started out back in 2012 as a group of volunteers organizing meetups and trainings and contributing to OpenStreetMap and growing the OpenStreetMap community in Uganda. And in the process, wanted to spread like our network across the country because we saw there was a data gap that we could fill working with around geospatial data in Uganda. So what we did in 2017, with the support from the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, which was carrying out a project to do mapping for financial inclusion in the country. We registered as an NGO, and doing this opened up doors for us. We could engage better with government, with organizations, because what we realized, if you just come as a group that's not officially recognized, you have like limitations, but having a registered organization helps open up doors, and you can engage more people, more organizations. So that's our journey. We have members, including universities. So we have what we call youth mappers chapters that are spread across different universities in the country. 10 of them now are members of our community, and we engage them in our activities, especially when we do participatory mapping in communities where people don't have like the technical capacity, but they have like the local knowledge. We do pair up university students with community members, and they do side-by-side data collection and mapping. One of the other projects I want to share about is the mapping we did for refugees in Uganda. So Uganda hosts over 1.5 million refugees who are mainly coming in from South Sudan because of the insurgents there, and also the Democratic Republic of Congo. So this is a big number of people coming in, and Uganda has a progressive refugee hosting policy. Refugees are allowed to free movement. They can get employment, they can access the education and health facilities. But remember, Uganda is one of the countries with the world's highest growing population. So that means the resources which are really scarce are constrained more. So there is need to really measure what is available to be able to share it equitably amongst the population. So there is very many organizations working with UNHCR that are responding to the refugee crisis in the country, and they do offer different services around education and around health. So what we did is to work with the refugees and also the community members, because in Uganda we don't have like refugee camps, but we have refugee settlements, because refugees are settled alongside with the local population. So they share the same kinds of resources that are available for them. So what we did in this kind of participatory mapping, we worked with refugees and also the local community members living in these settlements to go around these settlements and map what is available in terms of health facilities, education, water. For example, we did mapping for water points, So we had like very many boreholes, some that are working and some are not working. And remember, there are very many NGOs who are coming to give this kind of service to improve access to water. So by doing this kind of mapping, we're able to assess what is available and who has access to what. And we trained these organizations that use to use OpenStreetMap data, because if the data is available and no one is using it to solve the local problems, still it's not enough. So there is a need to make the data that is created through participatory mapping useful to respond to the needs of the people. So if you come and do mapping and you go and people don't see their problems being catered for, the mapping that is done or the data collection will not be relevant to them. That's why we worked with the NGOs to show them where there are gaps in terms of services that they are responding to, so that they can use this better information to improve the services in these refugee settlements. The other project that we did is mapping for disaster risk resilience. And this was done in Kampala, the capital, but basically in the informal settlements of the city. We worked with government. So the Uganda Bureau of Statistics, the Office of the Prime Minister, the Kampala Capital City Authority, and we used, of course, there was use of drones, first of all, to capture the aerial imagery, and then worked with the local communities in these places to move around and map drainage, building materials, and map out like flood zones, flood areas in terms of participatory mapping. But this was a project that was initiated by the World Bank through the Open Data for Resilience initiative. What is good about this kind of approach is that you have this big institution coming and engaging the local community, but also putting government and the local community on the same table and working together to do participatory mapping to solve local problems. So I think it's a good approach, because sometimes local communities may not have enough access to government and also local NGOs. But when a player like the World Bank comes in and be like the mediator, then participatory mapping and data collection efforts can easily be implemented. So what we are seeing is that through participatory mapping, local communities are becoming active agents of change where they are directly involved in projects. So using open source tools and contributing to open data through OpenStreetMap, the local communities are coming at the center of what is happening. And this is good because it is reinforcing the capacities of the entire local ecosystem. The last example I want to give is the COVID-19 response. So through support from HOT, MAP Uganda is responding to the COVID-19 situation by doing mapping. So working with the youth mappers from different universities in the country, we have mapped 40 border entry towns across the country. And these are like places where people do come in from the neighboring countries, so they are high priority for the Red Cross and also the Ministry of Health in terms of surveillance in who is coming in the country. So through this kind of mapping, what we are seeing is that now local communities are no longer just waiting for aid, but because they have been capacitated, we do have these skills. Now we can offer to organizations like the Red Cross and the Ministry of Health what we do have in terms of contributing to these kinds of maps and making data that is freely available and can be used in the response to the COVID-19. So through participatory mapping, local communities are being empowered to respond to disasters. So this means that we are kind of able to, balance the power, where beneficiaries are becoming active agents of change through participatory mapping to be able to contribute to better services and improved impact. So I think for me, my lesson learned is that we need to make sure that local communities are empowered, have the capacity and the expertise, and also help to connect them to NGOs that are coming to work in the country, to find them ready to be able to participate as active agents in the process. Yeah, I just want to end it there and hand it over back to you, Martin. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Geoffrey. Very interesting. So we'll transition to Vanessa for the last presentation. I'll let you share your screen too. Perfect. Still loading. Okay, now we have it. If you can put it full screen.
Yes. Thank you very much. Is it working?
It's still not full screen for us.
There you go, I think now.
Yep.
Nope.
Yeah, it's okay. You can go.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here with you today, and it was very interesting for me to listen to you all. For me, mapping is something I don't know very well. I'm not a specialist, but I can see very well how it echoes the methodologies that we in F3E are promoting. I was indeed asked to talk about change-oriented approaches that we've been experimenting recently, and that can very well include participatory mapping, but not necessarily, not exclusively. Just a short reminder, yes, F3E is a French network. We have 85 members, which are mainly NGOs, but also other types of organizations, such as local and regional authorities that work for international solidarity. Our mission is basically to provide and produce resources, trainings, but also exchange learning spaces so that our members and other organizations can improve their practices, the quality of their actions, and have better impact. What's been a bit new for us recently is that we engaged into what we call research action programs to give space for innovation in methodologies. And we started this process with a program aiming at learning and improving methodologies collectively based on change-oriented approaches that I'm going to present. And we are now trying to enrich these approaches with a new program called the Social Change Workshop that is also looking at improving the implementation of gender approaches with an intersectionality perspective, and trying to see how change-oriented approaches can be relevant at the territorial scale. On this, we've been implementing since 2019 an initiative that is called Change Territories Through Collective Action. And we experiment those approaches in 15 territories, trying to enrich them based on the idea that social change can be more easily be experienced at a small scale. And you can read through the main objectives. What we call change-oriented approaches, it's not something that we really invented ourselves. It's more something that came out of a need for NGOs to better evaluate qualitative change. So we got inspired by various techniques that are existing already, but that are not very widely used in France. And we wanted to make them available in France, and by combining them into what we now call change-oriented approaches. So what's important about them is that they have principles, like values really, that and they are more important than tools themselves. I can see that from what you're saying, all of you, that it's really about this. You have tools, but then what do you do with them? It's another thing. So with those approaches, we start with a long-term and positive vision. The second thing is that you focus on stakeholders and not on actions, based on the assumption that if you want to get social change, then you need to change something in the social fabric, in the social system. So it's all about people, organizations, groups of people. And if this change, then you can actually change the system. So this methodology is about how you look at and you influence the change in the people themselves, in their behaviors, their perceptions, their practices, their interactions with one another. The third principle is to think of the stages needed to reach your vision. So it's really acknowledging the importance of small changes and baby steps that you need to go through when planning your actions, but also that need to be observed, analyzed, and maybe discussed when evaluating your actions. And all of this has to be done collectively. The fourth principle is to facilitate stakeholders in becoming agents, authors of their own change. Very often we still talk about beneficiaries, we talk about targets, and this terminology is actually very meaningful on how international solidarity actions still work with actually unequal power relationships between funders supporting NGOs and the actual players and communities in the field. So this principle of enabling ownership is quite key and needs both space and time, which you don't have necessarily, and that's a problem. We want to influence a little bit if that's possible. And the last principle, which is actually quite key and is linked to the previous one, is to facilitate change rather than thinking you can actually conduct change yourself and on your own. So it's important also to acknowledge this. It's about showing that you can only contribute to change, and there's a sense of humility to nurture here. So what it looks like, this is a bit of a simplified version. So for the purpose of the presentation, I'll mention these four main steps that are all supposed to be implemented by a collective of people. So the first one is to analyze the context and the stakeholders. Who are the key stakeholders that have a role to play? And what's a bit new about this approach is also that ideally you should actually put all those stakeholders together in a room to go through the second step, which is to define a vision, a positive vision again, and think about the change you want to contribute to in 10, 15, 20, maybe 30 years. So you don't look at only a small timescale project like 2 or 3 years, which are very often the scale of a project. It's quite a long process because people don't agree necessarily, but it's a good option to focus on a dream for the territory, the given territory, and not on the problems. And then once the vision is agreed, you need to go back to analyzing the stakeholders. That's quite key because the focus is on stakeholders. So the idea is really to think through who are the enablers, the blockers for that vision, who can contribute to the vision and how. And based on that, you can then what we call design change pathways. And about these change pathways, again, are about stakeholders themselves. So how can you change your practices, your behavior, your relationships, and so that the vision can be reached. And from these main challenges, you can define your strategies, and they're like smaller theories of change, assumptions. And here again, you focus on progression. And from that only, you can go back to the reality and see your activities again, exploring how, what is the implicit assumption behind your activity. And finally, it's also quite key. It's the idea is to organize a monitoring and evaluation system that is realistic and participatory. Very often, the M&E system is something that is kept in the NGO or something like that. And the idea is really to have full participation also in evaluation. So that's the main steps, more or less, that change-oriented approaches are based on. Just to give you a short example of what it can look like and how it works. Sorry, there's a lot of text. This is taken from one of our members, CCFD Terre Solidaire, and their partner Accor in Burundi. They were part of one of our experiment starting in 2014, and they used to run a project in the city of Sendajuru, where there's a lot of tenure conflicts around land, land tenure that impact quite negatively on social peace. So they decided to use change-oriented approaches. They put together in a room some 40 people, local organizations, local authorities, inhabitants of this city, and together they agreed on a long-term positive vision, which you can see here. It was quite easy to get to the vision, but then the second step was more complicated, because when you actually go into the details, it's another story, and people are not so easily engaging. But from this, they identified for each stakeholder, most of them being actually present in the room, how things would need to be changed on their side. So it looks like this afterwards. That's in French, sorry. So you have the vision in the middle, you have the set of stakeholders, and then each stakeholder has 2, 3, maybe 4 key challenges to reach. So they had to imagine those main challenges and sort of sign a contract on making those changes happen for themselves. So even though these change pathways can evolve in time, they might be wrong, they might change given the context, but they wrote them at some point. They wrote that the local land registering service wrote that they needed to gain technical skills. The inhabitants, the present inhabitants were aware that all of them needed to understand better the importance of registering their land, things like that. And from that, they could imagine actual activities to run. And doing all that collectively with stakeholders gave a sense of co-responsibility to all these stakeholders. So it's a contract at the beginning of a project, and then in terms of evaluating, it's quite powerful. And how it ended up is that actually the dialogue was possible suddenly. And also what was interesting in the process was that change-oriented approaches helped identify new issues that were not covered initially, like gender issues related to land ownership. So it was quite powerful. Just some learnings that came out of this experiment, and that we are also currently observing in our action Changing Territories through collective action. Change-oriented approaches are quite relevant when a project is weakened in its collective dimension. They also help identifying new stakeholders, new issues, and enable a better understanding of the relationships, as the focus is really on how stakeholders change themselves. Change-oriented approaches are powerful and mobilizing because they are based on a positive approach. Actually, it gets you get some fresh air basically, and you remember what you actually work for. Something else is that when you imply a variety of stakeholders, still acknowledging the power relationships that might be at stake and that are obviously at stake, and doing that all through the process of an action, also in terms of evaluating its impact, facilitates ownership and empowerment. It's a lot about taking power over the tools. I think I've heard that quite a few times before. And change-oriented approaches empower stakeholders in being authors of social change and not beneficiaries only. I said that already. What's also interesting is how it encourages a sense of co-responsibility on change pathways from the design stage to the evaluation stage. And that's especially true for territorial dynamics. And again, the process is as much as important as the results. Change-oriented approaches create by themselves results and changes for individuals, organizations, and for larger systems. It's how you see that methodology is actually quite political. And the last bit is that when you use change-oriented approaches, you also need to revisit, question a little bit your individual and organizational behavior. For example, in partnerships, and have a sense of humility on this. And it means that sometimes your legitimacy might be questioned, and you need to be fine with that. So I think I'm talking too much. So if you need more information, you can have a look at our website where you have information. It's mostly in French, but some stuff are in English, and soon we will have some of them in Spanish. I think I'll leave you now. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks a lot, Vanessa. It was a bit too long, but it's not an issue. So we already have a few questions asked in the chat, but before we start, so yeah, if you want to ask questions, you put them in the Q&A windows. So several people have found this. Most of the questions have been pushed to answered already. I see that Geoffrey has typed a few answers also, but I think we will answer them live afterwards because it's more fun. But first, I would like to use my privilege as a facilitator to ask a first question, which is open to any of you that would like to answer it. So obviously, this the theme of the GeoNG is about inclusiveness, and many of you have discussed it in several ways. But my question is that most of your presentation were displaying participatory approaches that were often focused on the neighborhood or a specific population, etc. But when you do a participatory project, say based on the neighborhood, do you have tips to make sure that the people that are, I would say, the less included within this neighborhood, so it can be, I don't know, like it can be women, the poor people, etc., depending on the context, of course, discriminated people. Do you have tips to make sure that they also participate? Like if you do, okay, I will work on this neighborhood and create a generic participatory method, I would say. Do you have tips to make sure that if even the most remote people from the participation will participate? It's a bit a difficult question.
I can go first, Martin. So I think one tip is to come with an intention of getting different people to participate in the first place. But what we have done in the past is to work with community leaders to identify like participants when we're going to do participatory mapping, and asking them to balance. So if you want like 10 people to participate, and then asking intentionally, can you get 5 men and 5 women? Because if you just say get for me 10 people, you may find that they just get for you only 10 men. I think it's better to always make the intentions very clear around making sure that the people that you're participating is like an inclusive group of people and represents different people in the community. But also what we have done in the past is also to do like community forums where we do meetings before the exercise happens and openly asking, okay, who is available, who can participate in this community mapping exercise. And that's where you get to to see who is interested and who can participate. But sometimes like you find women sometimes are shy when it comes to using like digital devices. So it's also good to always encourage them and say, this is like easy, you can learn this knowledge to be useful for you, but also to advocate for your community by doing mapping and putting yourselves on the map.
Geoffrey.
Thanks, Geoffrey, if I may compliment, actually very similarly, but maybe in addition to that, I think it's also important to sometimes intentionally create safe spaces for those people to participate. So just a very generic example, you know, if you mix up men and women in a group, again, this is, you know, just an example, but you may have women participating less and being more at the listener side, or, you know, just like validating things that have been said. So maybe sometimes it's also good to separate intentionally groups and create like subgroups where people can discuss certain things more openly. Again, I think this applies also a lot to maybe younger people versus elders, you know, where sometimes the power relations are that you can't say everything in front of everyone. So I think, well, it's important to create those spaces where everyone can listen to everyone. It's also important to separate groups sometimes to get behind some of the issues.
Thanks, Bea. Okay, if no one else wants to jump in this question, I think we have, I will start with the questions in the chat. The first one was to Sayouba, and so Leonie translated his answer by written, but it's actually also a bit the same questions than what Sylvie asked afterward. Have you ever met people against the participatory mapping process, government, NGOs, etc.? If so, what are the blockages and how can they be resolved? So Geoffrey, you typed an answer already, but you can repeat it if you want, and if others want to jump in, go on.
Come again, Martin, on the question.
The question was, have you ever met people against the participatory mapping process, government, NGOs, etc.? If so, what are the blockages and how can they be resolved?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It's very common to find blockages against participatory mapping. So you may go to map, for example, when we do mapping for in informal settlements in cities, and then you are going to go alongside with the capital city authority, with the city authorities. Very many times people fear and say, okay, these guys are coming to do mapping so that I'm going to be displaced from that place, because sometimes these are areas where informal settlements, so people like settle into like river banks, and like these are like places which are designated as like non-settlement areas. So even when you go to do participatory mapping there, and then you are coming with government people are scared and say you're coming to take away our land. So it's very important to do a public meeting and just make sure your intentions are very clear. Why are you doing the mapping? How is the data going to be used? Which kind of data is going to be mapped? But also designing the data questionnaires with them, like which kind of data is also useful for them, so that at the end of the participatory mapping, there is also information that is useful directly for them. And most importantly, to make them part of the process. So let them also be part of the data collection team of the mapping team, instead of just bringing people from elsewhere and bringing them to their community to do this kind of mapping. So yeah, we have faced some of those challenges, but that's with communities. And then when it comes to government and NGOs, I think it's always around authoritative data and who is allowed to do this. So when you do mapping, and then there is like a national government agency that does mapping, you may find a challenge if you want to engage them, because they will say we're the only ones allowed to do this kind of mapping. So for example, when it comes to mapping like government, like boundaries, this is like government is always in charge of mapping like boundaries, which are even disputed in some places. So explaining to people, to government, that, you know, however much it is open data, citizens can also contribute, and you can also trust this kind of data. So yeah, there's always issues around data privacy, but it's all about explaining that yeah, when we do this open mapping, some of the data that is public is not like put on, some of the data that is private is not put on a public platform, and that can be separated from in terms of when uploading to OpenStreetMap.
Thanks, Geoffrey. I don't know if someone else wants to jump in on this question.
Yes, maybe. Just I find it interesting that sometimes new methodologies people are a bit scared because you change their habits. Basically, it's like a bit uncomfortable. So I think there are two ways to go through that. One way is to really show the added value it can create for the person, the structure, the government, whatever. And if that doesn't work, and I think in what we experimented on change-oriented approaches in F3E is also sometimes you need to, you know, to work in a hidden way. In a way, you just need to start processing and start implementing and show afterwards, once you've tested and you can actually show that there's an added value, and then you can convince those blockers afterwards. So I think there is this option is also possible.
Yep. We also had a question on this aspect of showing the added value for the communities. So if you want to add on that, any of the panelists, how do you show the added value of the mapping activities for the community?
Well, maybe one thought, I think, and it relates to the question just before, is Geoffrey, you said communication is important, and I think part of that communication is also that it's the community leaders themselves who speak to other community members, and not just outside, let's say, you know, stakeholders or actors. So I think it's very important for people to speak to their neighbors and to have that conversation going on. If there's people who have more fear, maybe facing a process, then, you know, there can be an open conversation with other community members. And I guess a relationship of trust, if it's already there between, you know, a facilitator of that process and the community, of course, it's very essential. But if you come into a new context or situation, you have to build that up, of course. And then, well, to relate to the added value, I think it's maybe showing very concrete examples of, you know, what can this process lead to? And then again, it can be interesting to tap into, you know, examples from other countries or other communities, what that have brought, and really bring like some very concrete, you know, share very concrete experiences and examples of that. And I do think it relates also to this idea of, like, you know, approaching a community and saying, you know, we need this data from you, but what do you get out of it, and what is like your ownership over that in the process is very important to be clear about it. And otherwise people may feel like they're just being extracted of their, you know, data, knowledge, private information, issues, problems of their community, but they don't feel that they can actually follow up on it. So I think it's very important to have that conversation.
Thanks, Bea. I'm taking the liberty to add my own opinion on that. I think one aspect, as you said, which is important, is showing examples of other like project areas where it has worked and outputs for the population. And the luck we have when we work with OpenStreetMap is, since it's the same tool for everybody, basically, even if we all use it differently, it's pretty easy to display examples from other organizations and saying, basically, we're going to do the same in a different context with, like, of course, adapting the approach, but we can already show outputs even if it's not us developing it. And I think that's something that would be interesting to develop beside OpenStreetMap, like in terms of participatory mapping. So we have kind of a network that has been built around OpenStreetMap with the missing map projects and other things. But for the, I would say, less technical participatory approaches, it's not so easy to know what other organizations are doing because it's less structured as a network, or it's maybe less connected with our organizations at least. And so part of the idea of this panel was also to try to start building more connections between actors that do participatory mapping, not only with a technical focus. Okay, on the next questions, there was a concrete question from Brenda on how to join the OpenStreetMap activities, and Geoffrey answered it in written. So I think that's enough details. Maybe we'll get back to it at the end. Then we had a question from Annabella on, I will read it. What are some of the challenges in getting participants to actively mapping and the usability of OpenStreetMaps for new users? What are some of the technology barriers? And I think we can actually extend this question beyond OpenStreetMap on like barriers to using tools, whether it's technological or other barriers.
Yeah, I can start. So one of the barriers for new users around OpenStreetMap is, first of all, like technology, like access to devices. So very many people that we introduce OpenStreetMap to sometimes don't have access to smartphones or laptops that they could use to contribute, but also access to internet. Internet here is for example, in Uganda is quite very expensive. So if you ask someone to volunteer their time, and also you're asking them to buy internet to contribute, they think, okay, if I'm going to contribute by mapping, I don't have to also dig into my own pocket to buy internet. So that's also like a barrier because it's costly. But the other barrier I think is also around like volunteerism. So OpenStreetMap is a volunteer project where people volunteer their time to contribute to this project. So so going to a community and asking people to volunteer when they are also lacking like other basic needs, like someone is looking for something to eat and asking them to contribute to OpenStreetMap by mapping. It's also like a challenge. Of course, we're trying to find ways of supporting people through like micro grants that the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team gives to communities to do mapping, like to have access to things like internet and devices. But that's just one of the solutions.
I think, Geoffrey, you're touching about a very important topic, I guess, which is also like not to forget that we can also burden, residents, communities with the time that they volunteer. So also keep that in mind, in terms of participation, also keep in mind what you're actually asking in terms of time and involvement from people, and see how, you can not overburden, or how to avoid overburdening them, and to keep the balance. Just maybe a side thought.
Thanks. So we have 15 minutes left, so I will try to take as many questions as possible, but I'm not sure we can cover them all. I see there is a question in the Q&A panel specifically for you, Geoffrey, on the working with refugees in Uganda, so maybe if you can type an answer, then we won't have to answer it to everybody. Next question to all presenters was from Susie. Do you think participatory mapping is a universal tool that can be used in all cultures and areas? How can it be adapted? I'm thinking about how it might be used, implemented in my home community, a city in the United Kingdom, for example, in planning consultations or flood risk management. Currently, it's not widely used as far as I'm aware. You are inspiring me, but I can also foresee some challenges related to the culture.
I'm going to jump in there. I think, yes, definitely. I think it's very valuable to use these tools across different contexts. And I think, you know, the object or the process will be very different, and also the result, because say in your city in the UK, you're not going to be looking for like basic GIS data or like, you know, basic mapping and putting a community on the map, which is very much of an issue, of course, in other contexts. But on the other hand, it will be very interesting to understand how people perceive the territory, how to relate to it, how they relate to their neighborhood, what are their concerns and issues that you can also map. And I think particularly, you know, in our northern societies, let's say, sometimes we're way less connected actually with the space which we're living in, you know. And I think these kind of tools can bring out some of those processes or relationships that we have with the territory, but also maybe ignite, you know, different interactions between people in a neighborhood that haven't existed before. So I think it can be used in very interesting ways across different contexts.
Yeah, and to add on there, I think participatory mapping becomes more interesting when the data is also made open. So if we are going to ask, like, you know, local communities to participate, there's no reason, as long as the data can be released publicly, they should also have access to the data, so that they are contributing to this data, but they also kind of own it. And of course, it can be used. This data can be used in all different types of contexts, because yeah, it's geospatial data. It has like a location component of it, so it becomes more valuable, especially when it is shared openly, because everyone can use it for a different purpose. So you can use it for education, for health, for public transport. So we have seen very many examples of OpenStreetMap data being used. So there's no limit on how you can use it.
Okay, thanks. We have a follow-up question on a topic we already covered, but I think everybody's wanted to hearing more about that. It's a question from Pete. It's for Vanessa, but if others want to jump in. Many struggle to prove the value added of participatory community approaches in order to convince people after the fact, beyond anecdote. Do you have suggested methodologies for generating evidence in this field?
Well, I think it's really a matter of how you build your monitoring and evaluation system. I think very often you build your monitoring evaluation system on evaluating the results of your actions and not on the tools and the processes. So if you include in your M&E system a question or something to measure how the tool itself, or the process itself changes things and participate in making some more results, then maybe it's an option to gather more information and to be able to analyze that. Otherwise, you just don't know. Even if you adapt a tool, if you adapt a methodology and you don't measure how it might have implied changes in partnerships, for example, then you don't get to see it. So I think it's an effort you have to make right at the beginning when you change your methodologies, to observe that and to gather data, but also to discuss this data collectively with the people you're actually implying. Otherwise, it's less meaningful and it's not so much sustainable. So I don't know what others think, but I think that might be an option.
Martin, I think your microphone. Yes.
So I said, like, unless you want to add on what Vanessa was saying, I'm gonna jump to the next question. So question to Bea or Geoffrey from Jean. I fully understand and I agree with the importance of local initiatives in your mapping project. Can it conciliate with help from volunteers abroad, and how?
Yeah, I can go first and maybe Bea can add on. So the mapping that we do on OpenStreetMap happens normally in two ways, and it has like a very good model where remote volunteers can also collaborate with local communities to contribute to the map. So the way it happens is that we have access to satellite imagery where volunteers can trace things they can see from aerial imagery, like roads and buildings. But then the local communities or the local volunteers can add more specific information. For example, what building is, whether it is commercial or residential, where the local school is, where the health facility is. So that's a good like collaboration, and we have like tools to help to do that. So someone can directly go to edit the OpenStreetMap, which is open for anyone to edit, but also have like the hot tasking manager, where volunteers respond and map different areas in a collaborative way. So yeah, I'll drop some links in the chat that people can go to get more information. But yeah, there is a very good methodology for that already in place in contributing to OpenStreetMap.
Yeah, not much to add to that. I think, yeah, OSM is a very good example of how you can bring together people from across different contexts to work on a specific issue. Also, generally, I think it's important to, to have local leadership over that, regardless whether there's help from outsiders or not. But even in terms of, the interpretations of some of the data or the maps, I think it's just essential to have, of course, local people that actually can interpret, validate, and understand what is collected in terms of data.
Thanks. And we actually have one last question not answered in the chat, which is a question from Gilles, following up on something I asked before. Can language and translations limit the inclusion of certain people? If so, how do you usually face this? I think it's quite a relevant question. We see it already in our panel here, so if you have tips.
On my side, just one little anecdote is we tried to use those participatory approaches using writing, actually. But some projects actually decided to, for example, for the vision, you can very easily draw a vision, or maybe make a sculpture of it or something like that. So you can avoid writing down things if that's not relevant for the people. So it's really a matter of what tool is the most relevant for the people that are present. So that's just a small anecdote.
Go ahead, Geoffrey.
Yeah, and just to add on, yeah, it's very important to translate to local languages, because then the data that they are contributing to makes more sense, and they're of course like also collecting it in their local language. So to make like the translation part of the process, first of all, for them to understand like how the data, what the data that they are collecting and contributing to, what it means, and also how it's going to be used is very important. One thing that I have found very useful is to also share the products of the mapping and data collection with the participants, because sometimes people come and engage communities in data collection, and then they don't come back to share the results. So it's very important when you produce some nice maps from the data that has been collected, to share, like even like when you do like visualizations from the data, to come back and share with the local communities. What we did in the in Uganda, in the refugee settlements, we printed some maps because they were contributing to a digital map, but they didn't then have like access on the way to access this kind of data. So what we did was to print some maps, and people were happy to see, for example, the first map of their village in the village office. So they collected the data locally using like a local language, which was translated to English, but then the result was shared with them in a format that they could easily consume. So it's very important to translate to local languages. Yes.
Relating to that, one of the processes or tools that SDI has been pushing is basically have a platform that is also accessible for the communities that participated in the mapping and data collection, and to train them to actually use that platform to log in and to have access to it at all times. So that the information collected doesn't stay in our computers, so to say, of practitioners, but also is accessible to the residents that contributed to that work at any point of time in the future. Of course, that requires like putting time and resources into training people to access that information, and also to have access to internet and to different devices, of course. But I think it's also an interesting way of including young people in the process that are generally more interested in digital tools and technology, and it can even be like a very nice way of building capacities and of training young people to work on computers, to work on different devices. So again, this relates a bit to what Vanessa also said about process. Maybe the outcome of such a mapping process could even be just have a few people trained on using different technologies and devices, and that's already as well an outcome beyond the maps or the information that was gathered.
Thanks, Bea. So we are reaching the end of our panel time. I just saw that there was one last question from Annabella on examples of participatory mapping for climate change and disaster risk, and both Bea and one of our volunteers put examples from our organizations in the answers, if you want to check them. Thank you everyone for this your participation. It was really interesting, I think. I hope it's a conversation that, well, it's not really starting because it was already happening, but that takes a new step and will continue in the future. I think we have a collective goal to try to bridge more this between participatory approaches in general and participatory mapping. I'm very happy that Vanessa got to discover a bit OpenStreetMap thanks to us, because when we did the preparation call, I asked her if she knew it and she didn't. I was like, you're going to discover something. But we need also to do the other way around. So I think it was a really interesting example exchange. So for what's following up, so the recording of this roundtable will be available after GeoNG if you want. You can, of course, ask questions directly to the panelists after the session using the individual chats. So you go in the participants menu and then you can book meetings or ask questions directly to the panelists if you have further questions. We also have, for those who registered to workshops, 2 workshops that are a bit linked to this topic. So one this afternoon on open data, which is sponsored by the AFD, our main sponsor. It's in French, I'm sorry. So not completely inclusive, but it's inclusive to other people, I would say, this way. And we also have a workshop tomorrow presented by the CartONG team on our own recent methodological approaches in terms of sensitive and participatory mapping. So it will be facilitated by Leonie and Manon that you saw today moderating this roundtable. As of today, the next session is at 15 to 2. It's a networking session with the sponsors and partners. So you can book time with the sponsors and the partners if you want to ask them questions, which I strongly encourage you. And afterwards, you have the workshops, as I was mentioning. Okay, so thank you everyone, and see you in other sessions, I hope. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you very much.